Thank you very much indeed. What a great pleasure it is for me to be here with you today. Let me begin by extending my personal thank you to President Grimson, both for his invitation to me to join you here, but also for the immense contribution that he has made to the development of this Assembly. As President Grimson said, this is my first visit to Iceland. It is the first contribution by a Scottish First Minister to the Arctic Circle Assembly. And I think it is appropriate that Scotland is represented here today. Scotland and Iceland share ties of trade, of culture, of kinship, which go back centuries. In fact, the early history of our Orkney Islands in the north of Scotland was chronicled in the Icelandic sagas more than 800 years ago. And more recently, well, in 1874, if we can still describe that as recent, the national anthem of Iceland was composed in Edinburgh, the capital city of Scotland. And even more recently than that, Scotland gave, or at least I am going to claim today, that Scotland gave Iceland another anthem, your football supporters' Viking chant, which attracted worldwide attention at Euro 2016, was reportedly, but from this moment onwards, factually, inspired by fans of a Scottish football team, Motherwell. I bring that up because, of course, from our point of view, it was nice just to be able to claim any Scottish presence at all at Euro 2016. And I should perhaps convey some sympathies to the Finnish Foreign Minister and indeed the nation of Finland. Our under-21 football team played here in Iceland on Wednesday evening, and we suffered a similar fate to the Finnish team last night. The all-conquering Iceland, which England know about to its cost, seems to march on. Anyway, at the moment, Iceland and Scotland cooperate on areas ranging from energy policy to marine science to sustainable tourism. In fact, our tourism agencies are today signing a new memorandum of understanding. And of course, Scotland's ties with Iceland are mirrored in our connections to many of the other countries represented here today. For example, our ancestral ties to Canada or our trading links with nations such as Korea and Japan. We also very often learn from your countries in our social and economic policy. For example, right now, we are aiming to emulate and adopt Finland's policy of giving all expectant parents a baby box containing vital items to help them look after their babies in the earliest days, a concrete example of how we look to other countries to learn from best practice there and implement at home in Scotland. Now, Scotland might not quite geographically be part of the Arctic Circle, but in our heritage, in our culture, and in our policy approach, and very often in our weather, there is much that we share. Now, we did hear earlier on this morning in the opening speeches some gentle competition around which of the non-Arctic countries can claim to be the closest neighbour. I'm going to claim that prize today for Scotland because the north of Scotland is actually geographically, physically closer to the Arctic than it is to London. And that perhaps explains why we increasingly want to build closer collaborations with our Arctic neighbours and to play our part, to play our full part in meeting the challenges and indeed in harnessing the opportunities that Arctic countries face right now. The shared interests that I'm talking about are actually the theme of a major Scottish art installation, Prospect North, which I'm opening later today on the first level of this venue. So I hope that as many of you as possible will take the opportunity to visit that installation and enjoy what it has to show you. And of course, Scotland and all of our Arctic neighbours, and indeed all of the delegates to this forum, share a very strong commitment to tackling climate change. That's an issue that I had the pleasure of discussing with President Grimson during the Paris Climate Change Summit last December, and indeed it is the reason that he invited me to speak here today. And so I am largely going to concentrate in this speech on the steps Scotland is taking to tackle climate change and to promote climate justice. But in doing that, I also want to set out a wider message about the positive contribution Scotland wants to make to the rest of the world and our desire for even stronger partnerships with our northern neighbours. Now, the Paris Agreement, which stemmed from last December's summit, is without doubt the most significant step yet towards tackling climate change. I'm sure that all of us warmly welcome Wednesday's announcement that the agreement will come into force on the 4th of November. It is a quite remarkable achievement, not least for Ban Ki-moon, who will address this forum tomorrow and who has prioritised climate change throughout his tenure as Secretary-General of the United Nations. However, I think it's important to stress that Paris marks a milestone, not a final destination. A global temperature increase of 1 degree Celsius, which is what we saw in 2015, and of course, the increase in temperature in the Arctic is double the global average. That has already brought the melting of glaciers and ice sheets here in the Arctic, together with drought and extreme weather incidents around the world. The consequences of a 2-degree increase would be deeply damaging for all nations and indeed catastrophic for some nations. Among other things, it would bring rising ocean levels and an existential threat to many vulnerable Arctic communities. It would bring an increased number of famines and almost certainly a displacement of populations way beyond what we have seen from recent and current conflicts such as Syria. And I think that helps to explain why, when Ban Ki-moon spoke in Paris last year, he called climate change the defining challenge of our time. So it is essential that the world meets the overall target we set ourselves in Paris of limiting global temperature increases to well below 2 degrees Celsius and making serious efforts to keep them below 1.5 degrees. But let us all be clear, that will mean going beyond the specific pledges made last year, which would still lead to warming of more than 2 degrees Celsius. We cannot, as a world, simply applaud ourselves for the agreement reached in Paris, important though that is. We need to deliver on and exceed those specific commitments that were made last year. And I want to make very clear today that Scotland is determined to play our part in that. And although we are a relatively small nation, we are determined to show global leadership in doing so. As the video you just watched showed, in 2009, our Parliament unanimously passed our Climate Change Act. Using the year 1990 as a starting point, that act committed Scotland to a 42% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 and an 80% reduction by 2050. Now, it's worth noting that at that time, a 42% reduction by 2020 was the most ambitious legal target anywhere in the world. We deliberately set a goal that we thought would be difficult. At that time, many people thought that that goal would be impossible to achieve. However, we did achieve that target, our 2020 target, in 2014. Therefore, we did so 6 years ahead of schedule. So we're looking now to raise our ambition even further and do even better. We aim now to more than half our 1990 emissions by 2020. Now, that involves us looking at a huge range of different issues. Scotland has reduced energy use by almost a sixth since 1990, but we know we need to do much, much more. That's why we recently made energy efficiency a national infrastructure priority. And we see big opportunities for Scotland in areas such as renewable heat and developing the circular economy. And of course, we are expanding renewable energy supply. When our Climate Change Act was passed 7 years ago, just 28% of Scotland's electricity demand was met by renewable power. Last year, that figure was 57%. Now, let me be clear, that still puts Scotland a long way behind countries such as Iceland and Norway, but it is a big increase, largely caused by onshore wind production. We aim to do better in the years and the decades ahead, and so we're now increasingly looking at offshore resources as well. The video highlighted that our European Marine Energy Centre in Orkney is a global leader. In fact, more wave and tidal power companies have demonstrated their technologies there than at any other site anywhere in the world. Last month, I launched the first stage of the Maygen tidal array project. When that's fully deployed in the Pentland Firth, it will produce enough electricity to power approximately 175,000 homes. That makes it the largest planned tidal stream project anywhere in the world. There are also some hugely significant projects in relation to offshore wind. The largest floating wind farm in the world is being developed by Statoil, the Norwegian energy company, off the North Sea coast of Scotland. It's potentially a hugely important step towards making offshore wind economically viable in deep waters. Scotland's northern seas were central to the Norse culture that so many of the countries here share, but they can sometimes seem peripheral to the wider world. So I think it is wonderful that they are now at the cutting edge of global energy innovation. Technologies that are being tried and developed there now will play a part in providing the renewable energy that the world needs in the future. And of course, that won't simply bring environmental gains, it will also create economic benefits as well. In Scotland, the low carbon and renewable energy sector already supports more than 20,000 jobs across our country, and there is potential for many thousands more. And of course, other low-carbon advances, such as better energy efficiency, will make our businesses more competitive. The need to tackle climate change, first and foremost, is an overwhelming moral imperative, but it is also a significant economic opportunity, and that is true of the Arctic too. Alongside the challenges, there are opportunities. And so as long as we keep the protection of our precious environment uppermost in our minds, we should all be prepared to work together to seize those opportunities. Now, Scotland's approach to climate change is part of a deeper desire to be a good international citizen. We want to set a good example through our domestic policy and to learn from other countries as we do so. But we also want to recognise our international responsibilities. As part of that, as I've already said, we are very keen to work more closely with our Arctic Circle neighbours. But we also recognise our responsibilities to the wider world as well. Today, for example, we've announced a £1 million contribution to the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency. That's the fund that was established by the UN after Paris, in recognition of the fact that many developing nations currently lack the capacity to measure their greenhouse gas emissions accurately. Scotland's contribution to that fund comes from our Climate Justice Fund. As we all know all too well, one fundamental point about climate change is that its worst effects are often felt in developing nations, despite the fact that those nations have not been usually major emitters of greenhouse gases. The individuals affected by climate change are often the very young, the very old, the ill, and the very poor. Women suffer disproportionately, since they are often the main providers of food, fuel, and water. So the countries that have done least to cause climate change and the people who are least equipped to cope with its consequences are the ones who are being hardest hit. That's why in 2012, Scotland became the first national government in the world to establish a climate justice fund. We increased our support for the fund this year. So far, it has supported 11 projects in sub-Saharan African countries. Now, the fund is small in terms of the scale of the problem. It's tiny, in fact, but it makes a significant difference in the communities where it operates. And it is a powerful statement from a country that is determined to do the right thing. And that motivation also underlies Scotland's increasing role in international development. Last year, we were one of the first national governments to confirm that we would adopt the new Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, one of those goals relates to the sustainable use of our oceans and our seas. In doing so, we committed ourselves to tackling poverty and supporting sustainable growth within Scotland. And we also pledged to promote international development overseas. That's been a growing priority for us in recent years. We've developed partnerships with Pakistan, Malawi, Zambia, and Rwanda. In doing that, we work closely and well with the United Kingdom government. However, we also look to learn from other countries. For example, the Annual Contribution to Development Index suggests that 4 of the 5 most effective countries in the world in terms of the overall impact of their policies on international development are Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. And so Scotland is now pursuing approaches which have been pioneered by Sweden and others, such as the idea that all government policies, not just our aid policies, should be consistent with international development goals. It's a good example of how the exchange of ideas among Arctic Circle countries can have a positive impact across the world. Scotland's commitment to internationalism is relevant to one final issue that I want to talk about this morning, an issue that I am sure you would have been surprised if I hadn't mentioned in the course of my remarks. Earlier this year, the Scottish Government argued very strongly for the United Kingdom to remain a member of the European Union. We welcome the EU's practical benefits, free trade, free movement, social and environmental protections. But for all its imperfections, for all its many imperfections, we also admire the principle behind it, indeed the principle behind this gathering here today. We like the idea of independent countries working together for a common good. And we believe that on some issues, and climate change is a perfect example, 28 independent nations working together can have a bigger impact than one on its own will ever have. In Paris last year, the European Union was plausibly able to negotiate with the United States and China as an equal. It played an important role in influencing the talks towards a successful conclusion. So for all of these reasons, people in Scotland voted clearly by 62% to 38% to remain in the European Union. And so the Scottish Government is currently looking to find solutions which will enable us to retain the benefits of our place in Europe and our European Union membership. We're also arguing strongly for the UK to retain membership of the single market, even as it leaves the EU. After all, the different Nordic countries here have taken different views on European Union membership, but all, including Norway and Iceland, have chosen to be members of the single market. Fundamentally, Scotland will do everything we can to remain an open, inclusive and welcoming nation, working with our neighbours, playing a positive role in the world and strengthening rather than weakening our partnerships with other nations. Our friendships and our partnerships with countries around us matter deeply to us, and we will not allow them to be damaged by Brexit. And that, of course, is one of the many reasons that we warmly welcome the chance to contribute to this Arctic Circle gathering. At a time when insularity and protectionism can seem to be gaining ground, Iceland should be praised for establishing this important forum for international cooperation, and all of you should be praised for your presence here to take part in these discussions. I want to say very clearly today that Scotland will support this initiative in any way that we can, and we are keen to contribute fully, even more fully in the future than we have done in the past, to your discussions, your priorities, and your actions. In doing so, in committing to that, we recognise that the principles behind this Arctic Circle resonate, I think, very strongly with a significant moment from Iceland's recent past. Tuesday next week will see the 30th anniversary of the Reykjavik Summit between President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev. That took place less than a mile from where we are now. Now, the summit didn't see an immediate agreement, but General Secretary Gorbachev subsequently referred to it as the turning point in the Cold War. Within 14 months, the USA and the USSR had negotiated reductions in missile stocks, which would have seemed inconceivable in previous decades. And just 3 years later, the Berlin Wall fell as the Cold War came to an end and barriers across Europe came down. Just before he departed for Reykjavik, President Reagan remarked on Iceland's willingness to act as host. He said that there could be no better testimony to the enduring commitment of the Icelandic people and government to the search for a just peace. Now, the fears of the Cold War have receded and been replaced now by other issues, including rising isolationism and international security concerns. But arguably, the defining challenge of our generation, as Ban Ki-moon said last year, is climate change. And so it is really fitting that Iceland is again demonstrating its enduring commitment to a just and peaceful world. You're bringing people together to help find solutions to climate change and to the many interrelated challenges and opportunities that Arctic Circle countries share. Scotland, a country proud of our Nordic connections, committed to our European neighbours and keen to work with our friends from around the world, is, if I may say so, an obvious and a very willing partner for all of you. So I wish all of you here at this gathering all the best for the rest of the Assembly. I hope that it can, I'm sure that it will, play a big part in addressing climate change, in promoting climate justice, and encouraging peace and sustainable prosperity. Because by doing so, it will make a positive contribution, not just to the people and the environment of the Arctic, but to the well-being of the world as a whole. Thank you very much indeed.